All right, we're looking at the first half of chapter 3 right now. So the case study is about tropical rainforest deforestation. So the major causes of deforestation: farming, cattle grazing, and settlements. It's not to make paper or building materials necessarily. The effects of deforestation, particularly in tropical rainforests, you have loss of biodiversity, an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and changes in regional weather. Our next unit will deal specifically with biodiversity. We'll talk a lot more about those increases in carbon dioxide when we get to air pollution and climate change, and changes in regional weather will come up in our next unit as well. So we get into 3.1, what keeps us and other organisms alive? So first, need to be familiar with some different spheres. So the atmosphere is all of the air surrounding our planet. It's divided up into layers, which we'll talk about later on, but the two we are most concerned with is the troposphere, which is the air we're breathing, is where our greenhouse gases are, where weather is, and just above that, the stratosphere, where we find ozone. Water is known as the hydrosphere. And then we have the geosphere, which is kind of the earth, right? The core, the mantle, and the crust. And then the biosphere is all the parts that support life. No notes on this page, but we can see some diagrams of the biosphere and geosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, etc. Then we get into how this all relates to the sun and climate. So if we think back to the second law of thermodynamics, we have a one-way flow of very high-quality energy coming in from the sun, but through lots of different reactions that get sent back to space as low-quality heat eventually. Later on this same page 57, we have an identification of the greenhouse gases in the troposphere, so carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. They all absorb that infrared radiation, that heat energy from the Earth, and then trap the heat on the planet. In 3.2, what are the major components of an ecosystem? Definitely know this diagram that shows the levels of organization. We're going to focus on ecosystems primarily and everything that happens there, because it gets much more complicated with all of our different feedback loops, etc. Then we get into a review of photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Definitely know the equation for photosynthesis. Remember, it's done by autotrophs or producers. In oceans, our primary producers are phytoplankton. So very small, usually microscopic, kind of free-floating, plant-like organisms that are responsible for producing a lot of energy. Chemosynthesis uses hydrogen sulfide gas as the energy source rather than light. So this is used by producers in the deep sea near hydrothermal vents. No light, but they can use that hydrogen sulfide gas. All right, remember food webs and food chains. Arrows always point in the direction in which energy is flowing. So from producers to herbivores or primary consumers, from herbivores to carnivores or secondary consumers, and then omnivores can eat all sorts of things. Decomposers such as bacteria and fungi help to release nutrients back to the soil, water, and air. Not to be confused with detritivores. They eat detritus, or dead things, and waste. So worms, insects, vultures, they eat waste and dead organisms. Also helps to recycle some things. Then page 61, we have a review of aerobic respiration, pretty much the opposite of photosynthesis. This produces ATP. It's used by all organisms except anaerobic organisms. So they don't use oxygen and go through anaerobic respiration. Mostly some bacteria are anaerobic. And then on our science focus box, we have a nice kind of recap of why microorganisms can be so important. They can, they populate our intestines and help with digestion, food production, such as bread, cheese, yogurt, all relies on microorganisms. Water purification, which we'll talk about later on this year. Nutrient cycling, which is later on in this chapter, and photosynthesis, all done by microorganisms. So super important. Then chapter 3, section 3, what happens to energy in an ecosystem? So here again, that arrow represents a flow of energy. As the energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, it gets lost as heat. So that's what we can see down in this figure 312, representing all of the heat that gets lost at each energy change. When you hear the term biomass, that refers to the dry weight of all organic matter. Okay? And keep in mind, when you're looking at a food chain or a food web, it's not depicting the biomass or the numbers. It's just a representation of the types of organisms. So they're not the end-all be-all for looking at things. So if you look at this food web right here, there's a lot more phytoplankton than killer whales in the ecosystem. More complex food webs equal more stable communities. Very important to keep in mind. Think about those feedback loops, right? The more complicated they are, the less of a change one change will have, or the less of an effect one change will have. So if we look at this one, what would happen if the squid population were suddenly decreased? Okay, initially there'd be some changes. Over time, though, hopefully it wouldn't be as dramatic. The equation right here, NPP equals GPP minus respiration. NPP is your net primary productivity. Now let's come back to that in a second. GPP is gross primary productivity. This is the rate at which photosynthesis actually produces chemical energy in the form of glucose, starch, etc. The R is respiration, so that's the rate of respiration. So all producers, remember, have to go through cellular respiration. So they use a lot of the energy that they produce. What's left over is the NPP, the net primary productivity. So that's the energy that gets stored in tissues and then is available to consumers. Hopefully you remember this pyramid here, the 10% rule. It's a very general rule, but generally only 10% of energy is available to the next trophic level. So producers make 100% of the energy, but they basically use about 90% or it's lost as heat, and then only 10% is available for primary consumers, etc. And then this last figure, 315 in this section, pay attention to the how it's labeled. So the net primary productivity is measured in kilocalories per meter squared per year. Okay? So the open ocean, if we were to look at just the total kilocalories produced per year by ecosystem, open ocean would be much, much higher than estuaries, for example, because it's so big. But per square meter, its primary productivity is relatively low. So do a second part of this chapter in the second video.